I was 7 years old the first time I understood that love could be uneven, that it could tilt sharply in one direction and leave you standing on the cold side of it, pretending you didn't feel the wind. I remember the kitchen smelled like boiled potatoes and soap that day. My brother stood beside my mother, his small fingers wrapped confidently around her skirt, while I hovered near the doorway with a bleeding knee and a mouthful of words I didn't know how to say. I had fallen on the gravel outside, skin torn, tears burning my eyes, heart pounding with the hope that she would rush to me, lift me up, tell me I mattered just as much. Instead, she barely turned. Her eyes went straight past me, settling on him, asking if he was hungry, if he was tired, if he wanted another biscuit. That was the moment something inside me quietly broke. Not loudly, not in a way anyone else noticed. It broke the way old porcelain cracks, softly and visibly at first, but never quite the same again. I told myself it was nothing. Children tell themselves lies because the truth is too heavy to carry in small hands. I wiped my blood on my dress, swallowed my tears, and learned the first lesson of my life. If you want to survive, you learn to disappear. My brother was not cruel. That's what made it worse. He didn't steal her love on purpose. He simply existed in a way that pulled her toward him, as if he were the sun and she was something that needed his warmth to live. He was softer, quieter, more fragile in her eyes. I was the sturdy one, the one who didn't need much, the one who could wait. "You're strong," she'd say, brushing past me to tend to him. "You'll be fine." Strong became another word for invisible. As we grew older, the pattern deepened like a groove worn into wood. If he cried, she ran. If I cried, she sighed. If he failed, she defended him. If I failed, she reminded me to try harder. I learned to fold my needs small, to tuck them away neatly where no one would trip over them. I became good at being agreeable, useful, quiet. At night, lying in the narrow bed we shared as children, I would listen to him breathe, steady and untroubled, and wonder what it felt like to be chosen without having to earn it. Sometimes I hated him for it, and then hated myself for that hatred. Guilt settled into me early, heavy and constant. I learned to smile through it. I learned to love him anyway. I learned to pretend none of it hurt. But hurt has a way of aging with you. It grows bones. It learns your name. By the time I was a teenager, the favoritism was no longer subtle. It announced itself at the dinner table, in conversations that slid around me as if I were furniture. When I spoke, she corrected me. When he spoke, she listened. When he dreamed, she encouraged. When I dreamed, she warned me to be realistic. I once told her I wanted to leave, to go far away and become something more than what this house allowed me to be. She laughed, not cruelly, but dismissively, and said, "Girls like you don't need all that." Girls like me. I carried those words like a bruise. When he got into trouble, she softened. When I did, she hardened. When he broke something, it was an accident. When I did, it was carelessness. Slowly, quietly, I came to believe her version of me. I became the problem she never said out loud, but always implied. Love, I learned, was conditional. Approval was something you could lose, and once lost, it might never return. I left home as soon as I could, not dramatically, not with slammed doors or shouted goodbyes. I left the way I did everything, politely, efficiently, without asking anyone to miss me. I married young, not out of passion, but out of relief. Here was someone who saw me, or so I thought. I didn't yet understand how easily a wounded girl mistakes attention for love. I carried my mother's voice into that marriage. I became accommodating, forgiving, silent. When my husband chose himself over me again and again, it felt familiar, almost comforting. Pain you recognize feels safer than pain you don't. Years passed like that. Decades, really. Children came and grew. I gave them everything I never had: attention, reassurance, fairness. I watched myself carefully, terrified of repeating her mistakes. Yet even as I loved them fiercely, a small voice inside me whispered that love was something that could still be taken away. My mother aged. Her hair thinned, her hands trembled, but her devotion to my brother never wavered. Even as he disappointed her, failed her, drained her, she defended him with a loyalty that felt almost holy. I visited when I could. I brought groceries. I made tea. I listened to her complaints about him and her quiet pride in him, sometimes in the same breath. She rarely asked about me. When she did, it was superficial, polite, as if we were distant relatives instead of mother and daughter bound by blood and a lifetime of unspoken longing. I told myself I was over it, that I was too old to still care, that childhood wounds should not bleed into old age. But every time she praised him, something inside me flinched. Every time she excused him, a familiar ache settled into my chest. And still I kept going back. Hope is a stubborn thing. Even when you know better, it waits quietly in the corner, believing that one day, finally, you will be chosen. I didn't know then that the real reckoning wasn't waiting in her words, but in her silence. The silence grew heavier as the years went on, the way dust settles in a house you no longer bother to clean because no one important is coming over anymore. I would sit across from her at the small kitchen table, now smaller somehow, as if the room itself had shrunk with her, and watch her hands shake as she lifted her teacup. Those hands had fed us, dressed us, held us when we were sick. Yet even then, when I was right in front of her, I felt like a guest who had stayed too long. She spoke about my brother constantly, what he needed, what he wanted, what he had done wrong this time, and why it wasn't really his fault. I listened, nodding at the right moments, murmuring sympathy. I had become very good at that, being the place where other people set down their burdens while no one ever noticed mine. Sometimes she would pause mid-sentence, squint at me as if trying to remember something important. My heart would lift foolishly, painfully, like a child rising on her toes hoping to be seen. "How are you anyway?" she'd ask finally. "I'm fine," I'd say automatically. Fine was the safest word. Fine never asked for more. And then she'd return to him, the conversation slipping away from me again, and that brief moment of almost connection would close like a door that never quite opened. I told myself it didn't matter. I had lived a whole life by then. I had survived things she never knew about. I had buried dreams and people and versions of myself. Surely I didn't still need her approval. But need doesn't age the way bodies do. It stays young, sharp, and desperate, even when everything else grows tired. When she fell ill, it was my brother she called first, even though he lived farther away, even though he was unreliable, even though I had always been the one who showed up. I found out later, through a neighbor who mentioned it casually, unaware she was reopening a wound that had never healed. I didn't confront my mother. I never did. Confrontation requires believing you deserve an answer. I wasn't sure I did. Instead, I waited. I waited in hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and fear. I waited at home for phone calls that came late or not at all. I waited for acknowledgement the way I always had, quietly, patiently, hoping that this time might be different. When my brother arrived, he swept in with noise and drama and apologies that sounded sincere but never lasted. My mother's face lit up in a way I had not seen since we were children. Her voice softened. Her complaints vanished. She forgave him everything before he even asked. I stood in the corner of that hospital room, watching them together, and felt myself shrink again into that little girl with the bleeding knee. Time folded in on itself. Old pain doesn't fade, it waits. There were moments, though, small, almost invisible ones, when I thought something might finally change. Once, late at night, when the machines hummed softly and my brother had stepped out to smoke, she reached for my hand. Her grip was weak, but deliberate. "You've always been so strong," she whispered. There it was again. That word. I waited for what might come next. An apology. An acknowledgement. Anything that said she saw what she had done, what it had cost me. But she only sighed and closed her eyes, as if that one sentence had taken all the energy she had left. Strong enough to endure neglect, strong enough not to need love, strong enough to be forgotten. She recovered enough to return home, though she was never quite the same after that. Age stripped away some of her sharpness, but not her preferences. My brother drifted in and out of her life, always taking more than he gave. I stayed steady, present, useful. I cooked her meals, I cleaned her house, I handled her appointments. I listened when she reminisced about the past, Carefully edited stories where I was either absent or conveniently obedient, while my brother shone brightly, flawed but beloved. I wondered sometimes if she remembered things differently, or if she remembered them exactly as they were and simply chose the version that hurt less, for her. Resentment is a dangerous thing. It doesn't explode. It corrodes. It eats away at you slowly until you don't recognize the shape of your own heart anymore. I fought it every day, reminding myself that she was human, that she had her reasons, that mothers are imperfect. But so are daughters, and some imperfections are born from neglect. When my children asked about their grandmother, I chose my words carefully. I refused to poison them with my pain. I told them she loved us in her own way. I said she did the best she could. Sometimes late at night, I wondered if that was true, or if it was just another lie I told myself to survive. The real fracture came quietly without warning, the way earthquakes often do. It came in the form of a small envelope, addressed in my mother's careful handwriting, delivered on an ordinary afternoon that gave no hint it was about to reopen my entire life. Inside was a single piece of paper. Not a letter, not an explanation, just a request, formal, almost cold, asking me to help arrange certain things in case anything happens. There was no affection in the words, no gratitude, just assumption, as if my role had always been decided and my consent was never required. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after reading it, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. I felt tired in a way sleep could never fix, tired of being dependable, tired of being overlooked, tired of being strong. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask the question I had avoided my entire life. What if she never chooses me? The thought settled into my chest, heavy and final, and with it came another realization, one that frightened me more than the first. If she never chooses me, what happens when there is nothing left to wait for? That was when the past began to stir, pushing its way toward the surface, carrying a truth I had not yet seen, but that had been shaping everything all along. The days that followed were full of quiet, almost ritualistic movements, filling out forms, taking care of details, being the daughter who always showed up when needed, even when the need was invisible. My hands moved as though they belonged to someone else, as though they had done this for years without asking for a break. But inside, a storm was brewing, slow and constant, like the deep rumble of thunder you feel long before it arrives. I went to her house that evening, the same house I had grown up in, the house where so many memories had taken root. The smell of old wood, of dust, of her perfume lingered in the air. It was a familiar feeling, but not one that brought comfort anymore. I was no longer the little girl who had sought her approval. I had been her caretaker, her support, her shadow. But the shadows were getting too long, too deep. I opened the door without knocking, as I always had, and found her sitting in the same chair by the window where she had sat for years. The chair seemed to have become part of her, worn into the fabric of her life. She looked up at me, her eyes soft and tired, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, I would see something different in them, perhaps a flicker of regret. Perhaps recognition of the years I had spent hoping for something from her, something she never gave. But she only smiled, that same tired smile that I had seen for decades. A smile that said she was grateful, but not in the way I needed her to be. "How are you feeling today?" I asked, my voice careful, the words slipping out automatically. She nodded. "Better, I suppose. You know, it's just age catching up with me." Her hands trembled as she set down the cup of tea she'd been holding. She never let anyone see her frailty when she could help it. Not when it came to my brother. Not when it came to me. Always the strong one. Always the one who did what was needed. The one who never needed anything. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw all the years of silent suffering at her, to make her see what she had done, what she had taken, what she had never given. But I knew better. Anger had never worked with her. It only made her retreat further into the fortress she had built around herself, the one that I could never breach. Instead, I sat down beside her, the silence between us settling like dust. We both knew what needed to be said, the unspoken things we had never acknowledged. But it wasn't something I could say. I didn't have the words to make her understand. So I stayed silent too, listening to the ticking of the clock on the wall, counting the seconds until I could leave without breaking. And then, just as I stood up to go, she reached out. Her frail fingers gripped my wrist, not tightly, but with enough strength to stop me. "I need you to promise me something," she said, her voice a whisper. The words were slow, deliberate. I paused, looking down at her. Her face was etched with age, but her eyes were sharp, still calculating, still holding onto something that I couldn't quite grasp. "Promise me you'll take care of everything," she continued, her grip tightening just a little. "Promise me you'll see to it that he's all right. He always needs someone. You've always been the one who could handle it." I nodded, my heart heavy, my throat tight. It wasn't a request, not really. It was an order, wrapped in the guise of a plea. And I knew, deep down, that she wasn't asking for my help. She was asking for my absolution. I promised her, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. I promised her because it was what I had always done. I promised her because that was my place in her life, and no matter how much I had wanted something more, I had never been able to change it. That night I lay in bed, the promise echoing in my mind. It felt like a chain around my chest, tightening with every breath I took. I wondered what would happen to me if I didn't keep it. What would happen to my soul if I finally stopped giving, stopped pretending that my love for her was enough to fill the empty spaces she had left inside me? I thought about the years ahead, years of making decisions for her, of handling things she should have been responsible for herself, of continuing to exist in the shadow of a woman who had never truly seen me. I had been so careful all my life not to ask for more, not to demand anything from her. But as the years wore on, it was becoming clear to me that I had never stopped needing her to choose me, and I had never stopped believing that one day she would. But now, I saw the truth more clearly than I ever had before. I wasn't going to be chosen. I never had been. And in that moment, I finally understood something I had been too afraid to admit to myself all these years. Love, as I had known it, was not something you could force. You couldn't make someone choose you. You couldn't make them love you in the way you needed to be loved. And sometimes the pain of that realization was worse than any wound I had ever carried. And so, in the silence of that long, painful night, I made a decision. I decided that it was time to stop waiting for something that might never come. Time to stop carrying the weight of someone else's love that was never meant for me. Time to let go of the need to be seen, to be chosen. I didn't know what that meant yet. I didn't know how to leave behind a lifetime of yearning. But I knew at last that I was no longer the child who waited for her mother's love. I was the woman who had learned to live without it, and that perhaps was the hardest thing of all. To realize that the love I had always wanted, perhaps the love I had always needed, was something that I could no longer reach for. But I would live, and I would find a way to live without it. The decision to stop waiting, if that's what you could call it, didn't come with the relief I thought it would. I had always imagined that the moment I let go of that long-held hope, a weight would lift, and I would breathe easier. But instead, I found myself adrift, untethered. The absence of expectation didn't fill the space it left behind. It only left room for more emptiness, more silence, more of what I had spent a lifetime avoiding. In the days that followed, I moved through my routine like a ghost. I still visited her. I still took care of her needs, because it was my duty, because it was what I had always done. But now, something had changed. I had changed. Every action felt like a performance. I gave, but it was no longer with the hope of receiving anything in return. I was a machine, a servant to a role I had played for far too long. My brother continued his erratic presence, showing up when it suited him, disappearing when it didn't. He never asked for help, never acknowledged how much I had carried, how much I had sacrificed. In some ways, I envied him. He was free, unburdened by the expectations that weighed me down. But in other ways, I loathed him. He had everything that I had wanted for so long, the soft, unquestioning love of our mother, the kind of affection that fills you up, the kind that makes you feel like you matter. And I had only the remnants of what was left for me. It was a week after that promise I had made to her that things began to unravel. I had come to her house, as usual, to check on her. I found her sitting by the window, staring out at the garden. The sight was so familiar, it felt like nothing had changed. But when I stepped closer, I saw it, the fragility in her that had never been there before. Her hands were trembling, and her face was pale, her eyes distant. "Mom?" I called softly, stepping into the room. She turned slowly, her expression clouded with confusion. "What time is it?" she asked, as if the question mattered more than anything else. "It's 4 in the afternoon," I replied, unsure why she seemed so disoriented. She looked out the window again, her gaze unfocused, and for a moment I saw her as a different woman. Smaller, lost, not the strong mother I had always known. For the first time, I realized how much of her had been a facade, a carefully constructed image she had held onto for so long. And now that image was beginning to crack. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to be alone." The words, so simple and raw, hit me like a slap. She had always been the one who kept her fear buried deep, never showing any sign of vulnerability. But now here she was, old, frail, facing the truth she had never wanted to acknowledge. That her life, like all lives, was slipping away. I sat beside her, not knowing what to say. I had spent so many years guarding my own pain, trying to hide it from her, that I had never once considered how she might have felt, how she might have been carrying her own burdens in silence. For the first time, I saw her not as my mother, not as the figure who had raised me, but as another human being, a woman with regrets, with fears, with a lifetime of choices that had shaped her, just as my choices had shaped me. "I'll be here," I said quietly, though the words felt hollow. I had said them so many times before, but this time they meant something different. It wasn't about fulfilling a promise anymore. It was about something else entirely, a connection that had eluded us for so long. She didn't say anything else, but I could see the faintest flicker of relief in her eyes, as if my presence was enough. Maybe it was. Maybe that's all she had ever needed from me. And perhaps that's all I had ever needed from her, too. Just to be seen, just to know that I mattered. As the weeks passed, the distance between us seemed to close bit by bit. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. We didn't suddenly become the family I had always imagined. But we became something new, a fragile understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the years lost and the ones still ahead. I still had my moments of bitterness, my anger at the past. But I was learning to live with it, learning to let the old wounds breathe without letting them control me. I wasn't ready to forgive everything. Not yet. Some things could never be forgiven, at least not easily. But I could learn to move forward, to exist without needing to rewrite history. My brother continued to be absent, his presence a fleeting thing that came and went without explanation. But I didn't care anymore. It was no longer about him. It was about me. About finding my way out of the shadows I had lived in for so long. It wasn't easy. Nothing ever is. But I was learning to walk in the light, even if it was just a sliver of it. I visited her every day, and sometimes we would sit in silence. No grand confessions. No dramatic revelations. Just the quiet of two people, linked by years of shared history, sitting together, trying to make sense of it all. One afternoon, as I was about to leave, she reached for my hand again, this time holding it with more strength than I had expected. Her grip was firm, but there was something tender in it, something unspoken. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice fragile but clear. "I'm sorry for everything, for not being what you needed, for not seeing you." The words, though simple, cut through me in a way I hadn't anticipated. She had finally said it. After all these years, she had said the one thing I had always needed to hear. It wasn't enough to erase the past, to undo the years of neglect and silence, but it was a start. And sometimes that's all you get in life, small starts that slowly begin to heal what's been broken. "I don't need you to be sorry," I whispered back, my voice thick with emotion. "I just need you to be here." And for once, I wasn't asking for anything more. The days that followed that conversation were quiet, almost too quiet. The air between us, once filled with unspoken tension, felt different, softer, yet still fragile. I could no longer pretend that everything was fixed, that the years of hurt could simply be swept away with one apology. But there was something about that moment, something raw and real, that allowed me to let go of the constant ache I had carried for so long. I continued visiting her daily, but now it felt less like duty and more like something I had chosen for myself. I no longer expected grand gestures, no longer looked for signs of love that had always seemed to elude me. Instead, I learned to find peace in the small things, the quiet conversations over tea, the way her hand would curl into mine as we sat together, the way she would look at me, her eyes no longer clouded by the distance that had once separated us. But just as I was beginning to find a rhythm, to settle into this new understanding between us, life had a way of reminding me that things are never as simple as they seem. One late afternoon, as the sky outside began to dim with the coming night, my phone rang. I recognized the number before I even looked. It was my brother. I had been bracing for this moment for years, though I hadn't realized it until then. I hadn't seen him in weeks, months even, and while part of me felt the old pang of resentment, another part of me simply wanted to ask him why. Why had he always gotten the things I needed from our mother? Why was it so easy for him to be the one she loved most? I hesitated before answering. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, to let him live in his world while I stayed in mine. But then I remembered her face when she had said those words. "I'm sorry for everything." I remembered the way she had held my hand, as if that moment meant something to her, something she had been waiting to say for years. And in that instant, I realized that my mother, in her own way, was done. She had come to terms with what had been, and in her final years, she had made her peace. It was time for me to do the same. "Hello?" I answered, my voice steady, though my heart raced. "Hey," came his voice, low and tentative. "I need to talk to you about Mom." I closed my eyes. The old wound flared up, but I knew this moment would come. It always did. He had never been the one to take responsibility. It had always been me, silently carrying everything. "What about her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I'm coming by tomorrow. She's not doing well." The doctor said. He stopped, his words trailing off. I could hear the hesitation in his voice, the weight of something unspoken. "I just wanted to let you know." I waited, the silence stretching between us. I didn't know what I was supposed to say. I wanted to tell him everything I had kept inside for so long, to finally confront him about his absence, about the years he had taken for granted. But instead I only nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I'll be here," I said quietly, the words carrying more weight than they had before. It wasn't a promise this time. It was a choice. A choice to stand in the silence, to stop pretending that the past hadn't hurt, but also to stop letting that pain control my life. "Okay," he said, a trace of uncertainty in his voice. "See you tomorrow." The line went silent, and I put the phone down, the quiet in the room pressing in on me. For a moment, I let myself feel everything, the frustration, the anger, the hurt. But then, just as quickly, I let it go. This was no longer about him. It never had been. The next day, my brother showed up at my mother's house with a bag of groceries and a sheepish look on his face. He had a way of walking in like nothing had changed, as if the years of silence between us could be erased with a simple gesture. I watched him from the doorway, noting how little he seemed to have aged, how his presence was still that same mixture of arrogance and insecurity that I had always known. "Mom still sleeping?" he asked, not looking at me directly. He never did, not unless it was absolutely necessary. "She's resting," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. The tension between us hung thick, but it wasn't what it used to be. This wasn't about old resentments anymore. It was about the present, about the woman lying in that bedroom just down the hall. We walked silently toward her room, and I couldn't help but notice how he avoided looking at me, how his eyes flitted over the small things, the way they always did when he didn't know how to face something real. But it didn't matter. I wasn't waiting for him to see me anymore. I opened the door for him, and he stepped in. My mother was propped up in her bed, a pillow behind her head, her once strong hands now frail and fragile. She looked small, smaller than I had ever seen her. The woman who had always been larger than life was now reduced to this quiet, trembling figure. And in that moment, I felt something shift again. This time it wasn't anger or bitterness, but something else. a deep, aching tenderness. She looked up as we entered, her eyes blinking as if trying to focus. "There you are," she said, her voice weak but still laced with that same familiar tone. "Both of you, here at last." Neither of us spoke for a long time. It was as if we were all waiting for something, though none of us knew exactly what. Finally, my brother placed the groceries on the table beside her bed and sat down beside her. I stayed standing by the door, my arms crossed over my chest, my heart heavy with thoughts I didn't know how to express. "I'm sorry, Mom," my brother said quietly, his voice cracking in a way that startled me. "I've been not the best son. I should have been here more." "I should have," my mother interrupted him gently, her voice soft but firm. "You're here now, and that's enough," she said, her hand reaching out to take his, her frail fingers closing around his as if holding on for dear life. "We're here now, all of us." The room fell silent again. For the first time in years, I felt something like peace, as if the weight that had hung between us for so long had finally begun to lift. Maybe it wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. Maybe it wasn't even closure, but it was a start. I stood there, watching them, knowing that this moment, this fragile, imperfect moment, was all we had. And somehow that was enough. The days that followed were like a fog that rolled in and out of my life, slow and steady, creating an atmosphere of quiet reflection. The time I spent with my mother and my brother felt more like a liminal space than real life. An in-between place where we weren't quite the people we used to be, but not yet the people we could have been. My brother stayed for a few more days after that conversation, doing what he could, but it was clear that his presence was temporary, as it always had been. I wasn't angry anymore. In fact, I didn't feel much of anything at all when he left again. His departure felt natural, as if it were the next step in a well-worn routine. I kept up my daily visits to my mother, though, and something inside me had changed. The anger I had spent years nurturing, the resentment that had woven itself through my every relationship, was slowly dissipating, not because I had forgiven, but because I had finally stopped waiting. I no longer hoped for a dramatic shift, for some grand gesture of love that would make everything right. I was beginning to understand that what had been broken between us was something only time could mend, or at least, only time could teach me to live with. One evening, as I sat next to her bed, I noticed how much quieter the house had become. The sounds of the world outside, the hum of cars on the street, the occasional bark of a dog, seemed distant, as if they no longer belonged to this house. The house was a world of its own now, a place of old memories and soft whispers. My mother was asleep, her breathing shallow and slow, but her face was relaxed in a way that it hadn't been in years. There was a peace in her stillness that I had never expected to see. For the first time, I realized how much she had been holding on to, not just for herself, but for us. She had held on to a strength that wasn't really her own, a strength she thought she needed to give to her children, to make us proud, to make us feel loved. But in the process, she had buried everything that might have been for herself, and in doing so, she had lost a piece of herself. I hadn't realized how much she had carried until I saw her like this, finally unburdened. It was in her silence, in the way her hands no longer trembled, in the way her gaze seemed unfocused, yet at peace. And then it hit me. She was letting go. She was letting go of the expectations, letting go of the guilt, letting go of all the things she had never said. She had become something more fragile, something more human, and I could see that she was ready to rest, ready to stop pretending. I leaned forward in my chair and looked at her for a long time. I didn't know how much time she had left, no one did, but in that moment, I realized that it didn't matter. The years of my own waiting, of my own longing for her to see me in the way I needed her to, were now just echoes in the past. I had become someone new, someone who was finally able to stand on her own without constantly seeking validation. I had learned to stop waiting for her to choose me, and that, in itself, had given me the freedom I had been seeking all my life. The next day, I found myself sitting by her side again. This time, she was awake, her eyes flickering open as if the weight of the world had just been lifted from her shoulders. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked softly, her voice hoarse with age, but her tone still warm. She had always had that warmth, even when I felt like I had to fight for it. I'm fine, I said, my voice steady, though a smile tugged at my lips. I'm just here with you. She reached for my hand, her fingers feeling lighter now, as though they weren't carrying the weight of a lifetime anymore. You've always been so strong, she murmured, her voice trailing off. I smiled gently. I learned from the best. She looked at me then, truly looked at me, and in that moment I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. The mother who had never allowed herself to be weak, never allowed herself to be anything other than the one who gave, was finally letting herself be seen. And in return, I allowed myself to see her, flawed, tired, and human. I'm sorry for everything, she whispered again, the words carrying a weight that felt different this time. This wasn't just an apology for the past, it was a recognition of the present, a recognition of the things that had gone unsaid and the things we had both been too afraid to face. I squeezed her hand gently. I know, Mom, I know. We sat there together in silence for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable anymore, but peaceful. It wasn't about the years of regret or the things we had never said. It was just about being present, in the moment, with no expectations. That night, I stayed longer than usual. I helped her into bed, adjusted her pillows, and made sure she was comfortable before sitting down next to her. As she drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. I wasn't sure how much time we had left, how much time she had left, but I finally felt at peace with the reality of it all. The following morning, my brother returned. He looked tired, worn out from whatever personal struggles had been keeping him away, but he was here, and that was all that mattered. He greeted me with a curt nod, the kind of greeting that had always passed between us, neither warm nor cold, but simply the recognition of shared history. He sat down next to her, and I stayed back, silently watching them. I've been thinking, my brother said quietly, glancing at me as if unsure how to start the conversation. Maybe, maybe I haven't been the best son. Maybe I've taken you for granted. Maybe I should have done more. My mother didn't say anything, but I saw the way her eyes softened, the faintest flicker of understanding passing between them. It was small, too small to change everything, but enough to begin the process. Enough to let go of the past, even if just a little bit. I don't know what to do now, my brother continued, his voice quieter, almost lost. But I'm here. I'll try. I don't want to regret it anymore. For the first time in my life, I saw my brother, really saw him, as someone who had been hurt just as much as I had. He had lived under the same shadow, felt the same sting of neglect, and he had carried it in his own way just as I had. And though I didn't know what that meant for the future, I knew one thing: we were finally in the same place. As I left the room, I glanced back at them. My mother and my brother, sitting together, each carrying their own burdens, but also sharing something they hadn't been able to share before. The past wasn't going to change, but maybe, just maybe, we could begin to move forward from here. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight lift just a little bit more. Maybe the waiting was over. As the days drifted by, something strange happened. There was no dramatic shift, no grand event that marked the end of this chapter, but instead, a quiet settling. It was as if the house itself had exhaled, releasing a breath it had held for so long. My mother, in her fragile state, no longer clung to the need to be strong for all of us. And I, in turn, no longer sought to prove that I could hold it all together alone. The visits to her room became routine, but they felt less like obligations now. I didn't have to pretend anymore, didn't have to mask the years of longing with polite smiles and stiff postures. For the first time, I allowed myself to simply be with her. And in those moments, I began to notice the smallest details that I had overlooked for so long. The way her hair had turned silver at the roots, the soft creases around her eyes, that told the story of a lifetime spent worrying, loving, giving. One evening, as I sat by her bedside, the conversation shifted. It wasn't forced, it wasn't rushed. It was one of those rare moments when time felt suspended, and all that mattered was the connection between us. I never thought you'd forgive me, she said, her voice low but steady. I looked at her surprised. I hadn't expected to hear that. I never really thought about forgiveness, I replied honestly, my voice soft. I thought I needed you to choose me. I didn't realize that I could choose to stop waiting. She nodded slowly, as if she understood, though I wasn't sure she did. I wish I had been more for you, she murmured, her voice breaking slightly. I wish I hadn't been so caught up in my own fears. I sat in silence, watching the slow rhythm of her breath. We did the best we could, Mom, I said finally. That's all anyone can do. And in that quiet moment, something passed between us, an unspoken understanding that we had both been trapped by our own expectations, our own limitations. But now, in this new chapter, we didn't have to be perfect. We didn't have to fix everything. We just had to be, and that was enough. The following days carried on with a gentle rhythm. My brother, as always, was in and out of her life, never staying long enough to form anything lasting. But I no longer resented him. I didn't need to. My journey had taught me that no one could give me what I needed unless I first gave it to myself. One morning, weeks later, I found myself standing in her room watching as she slept. She looked smaller now, quieter, and yet there was something about her presence that felt more complete than it had in years. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that we had reached a place of peace, even if it was fleeting, even if it was fragile. I realized then that I no longer needed her to be everything I had wanted her to be. I had spent a lifetime waiting for her love to fill me, but now I had learned to fill myself. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift I could give both of us. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting by her side, watching her sleep, not rushing to say anything, not needing to fill the silence with words. For the first time, I simply allowed myself to be in the moment. The waiting was over, and in that stillness, I found the peace I had been searching for all along. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And sometimes, real is all you need. When I finally left her room that evening, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had found what I had been searching for all these years, not in her, not in my brother, but in myself. And that, I realized, was the true meaning of healing.